Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. This first hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, looking at a decision we did mention yesterday. Actually, I should say Friday, but for those of you that hear the rebroadcast, maybe you heard it yesterday. And that is what's called the Bostock case, and it has to do with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we'll get into that. A little bit later this hour, one of my articles I've posted, Fathers Will Always Be Essential. Yesterday was Father's Day, and Rick Santorum wrote a very good piece. And then there's kind of a follow-up we might talk about. Black fathers matter as well, which is kind of a run-up to the conversation we're going to have next hour, where Will Ford, who's been with us before, will be in studio. We're going to talk about racial reconciliation. Of course, he has an incredible story of his own family that had been under slavery and some of the things that he discovered. And so it's a great story, but also he will give us some great ideas and some very concrete, practical ideas on what we can do to begin to reach out to individuals which we may be estranged from because of political issues, racial issues, or whatever. So we'll certainly spend some time talking about that with him. And for those of you that like to listen to the third hour, we will come back to some of the issues we've been talking about, but we will end by a conversation with Michael Heiser. There have been a lot of people that have really appreciated his book on demons. Now, he's written about the unseen war. He's written about angels, but this one on demons maybe clears up a lot of misconceptions people have about the demonic world, so we'll get into that as well. First of all, we bring to the microphone Jonathan Saenz. Again, such a great opportunity to hear from him. President of Texas Values. Used to, for a while, head up Liberty Institute's offices in Austin. He's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and has his law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. And we have posted a very good video. It's our one of our first articles we've posted here, entitled Family Leaders Discuss Supreme Court Ruling. It goes on for about 17 minutes, so if you don't catch all of it right now, you can watch that, or maybe even post it on your Facebook page or send it out on a Twitter feed. But Jonathan Saenz, always great to have you on this program.
Hey, Kerby, thanks for having me on.
You guys have been involved in this. I think you even filed a brief, if I remember right. But the Civil Rights Act in 1964 was an attempt really to prevent discrimination on race, color, religion, and national origin. Then there was an amendment added to add sex to that. I think in 1964, everybody knew what sex meant. I think everybody now knows what sex means, male and female. But somehow, an individual who has never been really good about rewriting law, but instead usually sends it back to Congress or to the legislature, Neil Gorsuch, on this particular case, made the unbelievable step to move beyond saying that sex means male and female, but it also means sexual orientation and gender identity. What are your initial thoughts about that ruling?
Well, in case some of your listeners hadn't heard, during June, the Supreme Court puts out a lot of decisions, the U.S. Supreme Court, and a lot of times there are very issues that there can be a lot of disagreement on, a lot of different views on, and so that's no different this year in June. And so last week, the Supreme Court issued a decision redefining sex to include the words sexual orientation and gender identity. And what that effectively means is, in 1964, the word sex had to effectively mean sexual orientation and gender identity for employment discrimination issues. And many of us agree, including the President's administration and the Department of Justice, and so many people, including our organization, Texas Values, that joined a legal brief on a collection of 3 cases on this issue at the U.S. Supreme Court, that doesn't make any sense. The only entity that would have the ability to change and redefine sex would be Congress. Congress has taken up this issue, and they've rejected redefining it. Texas legislature has been asked to redefine sex to include gender identity and sexual orientation. They refuse to. And that's why the Supreme Court's ruling in this role, not acting as a judiciary, but really legislating from the bench, creates chaos. And it is a rewrite of the Civil Rights Act. It's been rejected by Congress. It's been rejected by the legislature. And we think it's a type of overreach that's going to be devastating for America on the issues of health care, on the issues of free speech, on the issues of amateur and professional sports, and also as it relates to religious liberty, and not just generally for religious liberty, but also for churches and religious nonprofits.
And again, one of the things I like about the video that we have linked to, or they can just simply go to Texas or txvalues.org to find it either way. But what they will find is the impact it'll have on like women's sports and a number of other things. But just before we get into all the implications of this comes from Neil Gorsuch, who on a few other occasions, if I can quote him to himself, he says it's a fundamental canon of statutory construction that words generally should be interpreted as taking their ordinary, contemporary, and common meaning at the time Congress enacted the statute. And so he's made very clear that if the word sex in 1964 meant male and female, you are not right by a Supreme Court justice or any other body to reinterpret that. And sometimes, Jonathan, people have trouble understanding why that's important. And so the example I sometimes use, and see if you like it, maybe you don't, but I think it works real well. Imagine if you write in your will that certain amount of money should go to each individual, and then you die 20, 30, 50 years from now, and a lawyer comes in and says, I know what the actual will says, but that's not what it means. I'm going to change it all around. People would be horrified if they saw something like that happen. And yet, in a sense, isn't that kind of what the Supreme Court has done in this case and a few other cases?
Look, I think, Kerby, it's fair to make that comparison. And you're right, we have a lot of detail on this on our website, txvalues.org. And just so you know, the words texasvalues.org, we do own that URL. So if people write it that way, it's fine too. But the one we use is txvalues.org. We've got a lot of good information because there's a lot to figure out and unpack on these type of decisions. And that's why we think it's created chaos. And the reason why is because there's been a lot of disagreement on this issue. There have been court cases on this. There have been efforts at the congressional level to try to redefine sex. All of that, to us, makes it clear that is not what was meant when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written. It has been biological male and female. That is what we're talking about on the issues of sex. And so when you have terms like gender identity and sexual orientation that are subjective, that you can't apply consistency in certain standards, it makes it very difficult to have a consistent standard across the entire country, your community, your state. And one of the bigger things here is this: it's not the role of the courts to take this type of action. And that's why it's been, and we don't think it could have been any more clear.
Yes.
Congress has been asked to make these changes, and they haven't. That's an indication that that meaning has not changed. And so that's why you saw Justice Alito really call out his fellow Justice Gorsuch on this issue and talk about how he has misused his authority. This is not the role of the judiciary. This is what the legislative powers are, and they've spoken on this issue, and they've chosen not to make these changes. But it's really important because there are a lot of people that want this change to be made. The Trump administration filed a brief in this case. They don't want this change to be made. The Obama administration made this change without congressional authority, and thankfully the Trump administration changed it back because they had no authority to make that change. And so there's been a lot of push and pull on this, and so you've got to respect the authority and the system on this. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of concern, and it just certainly appears that the court completely overstepped their bounds. And we've got a lot of comments from people like Tony Perkins, from organizations like Heritage Foundation, and many others that agree that the Supreme Court got it wrong. But this is not the end of this issue. No. We do have a history. If Congress will push back, if the state legislature will push back and help us with our nonprofit work at txvalues.org, we could see this outcome be different, but people are going to have to take action now.
We're going to take a break and talk about some of the implications of this ruling right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new documentary reminds us how intrusive social media can be in our lives and how personal privacy is quickly vanishing. Kyle Smith writes about this in a recent op-ed and mentions the documentary The Creepy Line. The name of the documentary is taken from a comment by Google CEO Eric Schmidt. He has a nickname for the invasive nature of his company. He says Google policy on a lot of things is to get right up to the creepy line and not cross it. In the film, Peter Schweitzer illustrates how your search history gives Google an enormous amount of information. Of course, this is supposed to tell Google and other advertisers what you like to buy. But this enormous cache of information also tells anyone who has access to all of it all sorts of things about you and your personal taste. Google also has noticed that you would leave the search engine in order to surf the internet, so it developed the browser Chrome. That means that everything you do online through Chrome is also collected in this cache of information at Google. But that's not enough. Google wants to know what you're doing even when you're not online. So there's Android that uploads a complete picture of what you have been doing when you're not online. Smith concludes it's a surveillance business model. Google Maps, Google Docs, Gmail. Google knows more about you than your spouse does. Over the last few months, Congress has shown some interest in understanding how Google and other big tech firms make their editorial decisions. But Smith also reminds us that the federal government is a heavy user of Google products and has shown little interest in oversight. If Google isn't going to self-police itself, and if Congress isn't going to take any meaningful action, then we as consumers need to be wary of how Google and others use us and our information. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Thanks for joining us once again. Jonathan Saenz with us, and he is with txvalues.org. Texas Values, it's TXvalues.org. One of the things you'll find there is not only the information about the Supreme Court creates chaos with the LGBT ruling, but also an information about the Texas Faith and Family Freedom Forum, which is coming up here in September. And Jonathan, you know, we'll promote that quite a bit over the summer so that we get a great turnout, and you already have just a who's who of individuals. But I know a number of people that are thinking, well, this is very disappointing. There are all sorts of Supreme Court rulings coming down, but sometimes we don't see the implications. And one of the things I thought that was so well done by you and two colleagues next to you is to talk about the impact that this ruling will have. And one of those is on women's sports, especially amateur sports. Can you speak to that?
Well, absolutely. Look, I mean, if you redefine sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, you now get into the area of the transgender issue, as many people call it. And you have people who are a biological male who want to wear a dress or they want to compete in women's sports. They feel like they're a woman or they feel like they're a girl, so then they now can be in a position to compete against women that are biologically women, and it's created a lot of problems. It's created litigation. There's a new state law in Idaho dealing with this issue, and it's created a lot of injustice. I mean, women are standing up saying this is not right, and so that's what happens when you redefine words like sex. People use them for their own purposes. And look, this isn't a hypothetical. This is probably going to be breaking news for a lot of people. Mansfield ISD is voting on an issue like this tomorrow. Oftentimes, unfortunately, in some of the work we do, a notice comes out late Friday. We really only have a chance, until Monday morning a lot of times to let people know sometimes before, but, we were looking at some of this over the weekend, but still trying to get some good information. Mansfield ISD, I know some of your listening audience is nationwide, but obviously there in the Dallas-Fort Worth area is going to be voting on a policy. We're going to have an update on this, and so if you think, oh, well, that's kind of some pre-court case out of, the case came out of Michigan or wherever, no, it's about to hit home, and that's what happens when Supreme Court rules on a lot of issues. People say, okay, well, then now we want to push this agenda. And so Mansfield ISD is going to be voting on an issue that certainly could impact amateur sports. It could impact a lot of issues related to privacy. And so we're going to be putting an action alert up so people know in that area what to do very soon. But the Supreme Court's not done, to your point, Kerby, and they have a case coming up dealing with what's called a ministerial exception. That's the ability of religious nonprofits or churches to say, this is a biblical issue when it relates to our staffing decisions. And so we need to see what happens in that decision, because that could impact even further in a negative way what the definition of sex means, in addition to a pro-life case that we're involved in that's coming out. And that's why we want to encourage people to check our website at txvalues.org, because, and look, but a lot of this is, if we can have people have the right people in state legislature, have the right people in Congress, or communicate with them more often, that's what we need people to be doing right now. Call your congressman or your state elected official and say, look, I don't agree with what the Supreme Court did on sex. What can we do next? Congress does have the ability to take that authority back that was misused and say, no, we get to define how these words should work. And so we've had some elected officials who've commented on this, but certainly we'd be helped by people doing more of that.
And let me just mention, too, that during this hour, we tend to probably have more Texas listeners than when we go to the national hour, although I know we have people listening in at this hour all over the country. And for those of you in the state of Texas, I know they are coming to the end of their fiscal year, which is June 30th. And there's a tendency, I think, for a lot of people, especially in Texas, to say, I'm going to pay attention to the Texas legislature come January 2021. I'll pay attention to Texas values when January 2021 comes around. But I think you just illustrated, Jonathan, your work still continues on, whether the legislature is in session or not. True?
Well, no, that's absolutely right. And actually, the Texas LGBT caucus at the state level, they're already putting out articles and information trying to get support to radically change the definition of sex and all these other transgender issues. Think about it. If you own a business, the implication of this Supreme Court decision could mean that you are forced to pay for someone who wants to go through a sex change operation. These are not hypotheticals. These are things that are happening. If you call someone by the wrong pronoun, it's called misgendering. If you thought someone was a man and they say that they're a woman and you call them a he or a she, we've had people that have been fired for these situations. And so some really real case situations that we need to be mindful of. But you're right, Kerby. We have our end of our fiscal year coming up at the end of June. We're a nonprofit organization where these type of policies, our types of organizations, could be negatively impacted, and that's what some people want. They want to put people out of faith out of business with these type of policies. They want us to either change our policies or they want us to be punished in some ways, whether it's paying fines, dragged through litigation. I mean, it takes a lot of effort and time and money just to get up to the U.S. Supreme Court. If you have a chance to win, it's not just as simple as relying on what we put on the Supreme Court has said. People want to put a test to that. But that is the work we're doing year-round, and we're already preparing for the state legislative session. We've got our policy forum coming up in September. We'll be educating, but that work has already started. And so if people see value in what we do as a tax-deductible donation, we could certainly use their support at txvalues.org.
Let me again give people some action items, because we have a lot of activists. Number one, of course, watch the video. And you can go to txvalues.org or just go to pointofview.net because we have it there. Number two, think seriously about going September 18th and 19th to the Texas Faith, Family, and Freedom Forum. But number three, let's talk about voting for just a minute. Jonathan, I think if the last couple of years people said, I really just haven't paid that much attention. Who's the mayor? Who's the city council? I couldn't even tell you who my county judge is. It's not that big a deal. And then all of a sudden we see city council saying, no, we can't have Chick-fil-A at the San Antonio airport. Or a mayor says, I'm not going to let churches actually meet for worship or a county judge says everybody's got to wear a mask, and matter of fact, we're not going to allow anybody to get involved in any kind of activities that might even be considered a protest, although maybe we'll make an exception for a few kinds of protests that I like. And all of a sudden, I think people are starting to say, I got to pay attention a lot further down the ballot to who I elect. What are your thoughts?
No, you're absolutely right. And there are some runoff elections going on right now. In the Republican primary, there are several state House seats and federal seats that are up for a runoff, and some of them, I think, include your listening audience. People can see that information at txvaluesaction.org. And I mentioned in Mansfield. Mansfield is going to have, you can submit a testimony to them. They're going to have it online as far as a video when they take up this LGBT issue tomorrow. They're local elected officials. A lot of local races, a lot of local elections are now in November this year. They're usually not. Many of them usually happen in May, but because of a lot of the virus issues, they're going to be on the ballot at the same time you're voting for president and Senate, and along the line, people have got to go all the way down the ballot. In the city where I live, in the Central Texas area, we had one of our city council seats decided by 2 votes.
Yep.
This happens all the time, and so the ability is there for people to make a difference, and as simple as to your point, is going to vote and casting a ballot. Every vote absolutely counts, and we've got a lot of good election information at txvaluesaction.org if people want some good insight on where the candidates stand on these issues. But that is the key. I mean, you're going to get the vote, the government you vote for, and if you're not a part of the process, it makes it difficult for you to think that there are going to be people in place that share your values. And there is a lot of attention on this election this year, but it's not just at the president. It is all the way down the ballot.
I might just mention, too, when they go to texasvalues.org, you, of course, have action alerts and all the various issues that we can talk about. But most importantly, you've got your marching orders. And again, for those of you, the Mansfield area, you might want to get involved. You might want to just go to these websites, get some more information. Maybe you can trade some emails back and forth, and we'll see who can show up and make a difference. So, Jonathan, I appreciate the work that you've done. Thank you for having such a great website that allows people to be educated. As we get closer to some of those other elections, we'll certainly have links so people can get the great material that you always have made available on your voter guide. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, I appreciate that, Kirby. And also, if I could just ask for people to be in prayer for the work that we're doing and our team and our board through a very active time in the work that we do.
And again, this is one of those times where both you and Kelly Shackelford said, maybe we'll just kind of have to shelter in place. Actually, it's been a time when there's been more activity than ever, which is one more reason why I'll just say for your benefit, support this organization. I do. I'm not asking you not to support an organization that I don't support. I have sent money in the past and will send money again to txvalues.org. I encourage you to do the same. So, Jonathan, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Kirby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, thought I would spend just a little bit of time talking about fathers for 2 reasons. Number one, Rick Santorum, the second article that we've posted here, has done, I think, a very good job of reminding us how important fathers are. And then Katie Kiefer went on to even say, if you want to talk about what matters, Black fathers matter, and that's an issue that we should talk about. So we're going to talk about fatherhood, then we'll get into Black Lives Matter. Next hour, of course, we're going to have Will Ford with us as we talk about racial reconciliation. All that coming up right after this.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, yesterday was Father's Day, and we didn't really spend much time talking about upcoming Father's Day on Friday, and I thought it might be worth looking back for a couple of reasons. This was a very unusual Father's Day, as Rick Santorum points out, because the coronavirus kept a lot of fathers away from their kids and kids away from their fathers. Then, second of all, in light of some of the issues of what is happening in the streets of America, I would have to say that there is pretty good evidence that the absence of fathers in any home, whether black, white, Hispanic, whatever, is a problem, but especially has it become and has been a chronic problem in the African American community. Don't take my word for it. Go all the way back to the 1960s when Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a liberal Democrat, nevertheless warned about what this might do to the African-American family. Back then he called it, I guess, the Negro family was the name of the report, but we call it African-American or black family. And then, of course, we've seen not only has the rate of can I still use the phrase unwed births, out of wedlock births? I think that's still not politically incorrect. That has increased in the African American community, has also increased in the Hispanic American community, and also increased somewhat in the Anglo American community as well. All that to come back to Rick Santorum, and he said this Father's Day is like no other. Due to the coronavirus shutdowns, thousands of dads in nursing homes were not going to be able to visit their kids. Many kids and their moms would not be taking dad to the favorite restaurant. Grown sons and daughters living in hot areas are not traveling, so dad can spend the weekend with his children and grandchildren. The coronavirus, however, cannot stop us from celebrating the important day that we honor men who perform crucial roles in sustaining healthy families. Rick Santorum goes on to say, it has been exhaustively documented that the odds of successful life outcomes dramatically increase for children who have both a father and a mother in their home. These children have better education outcomes, fewer behavioral problems, and are less likely to use dangerous drugs or commit crimes. Now, do we have examples of single-parent homes which have turned out such incredible kids? Of course we do. And we can use lots of examples of that and have in the past. But the best, and if you look at the research, there are databases at everything from the Family Research Council to the Heritage Foundation and a variety of others that have looked at all sorts of refereed, well-documented research that all came basically to the conclusion that, you know what? Two-parent home is the best and shouldn't be surprising in that regard. And so, as Rick Santorum said, it's become kind of a sad reality that so many children, oftentimes underprivileged ones, are deprived of a two-parent home. He quotes from Tucker Carlson, who said, increasingly having a father at home is a sign of affluence, but it's also a cause of affluence. That's probably true. And research backs up that claim. So then he gets into the attempt, which I have seen so many times, to say, well, those are bygone days. We'll never go back to them. Or, since I already mentioned Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he used to have a phrase called defining deviancy down. Sometimes when things get out of hand, we say, well, maybe it's not so bad after all. And he uses an example of an essay that David Brooks, who we've quoted favorably and sometimes unfavorably on this program, pointed out that back in 1960, 77%, in other words, more than 3/4 of all children lived in two-parent married homes. But less than half of those households today have two-parent homes. And so David Brooks just simply says, well, the nuclear family, as we knew of it in the 1950s and 60s, was a freakish historical anomaly. And Rick Santorum instead says, I find this thinking to be defeatist. As he ponders how best to move forward, Brooks conspicuously avoids mentioning fatherhood, instead appears more intrigued by what he called forged families, that is, artificial, self-selected, largely non-biological families to fill the void. And again, I recognize that sometimes grandparents have stepped in or family members. There have been times in many of our churches where we've said, here's a mom trying to raise a kid, so let's maybe see if we can have this kid occasionally, this son, hang out with one of these guys, maybe whether it's at Indian Guides, whether it's Boy Scouts, whether it's going to Promise Keepers, whatever it might be. So I recognize that as well. But the best is, of course, to have intact families, which we don't. And then he points out that the other problem is that both the academic world and even social movements have marginalized the importance of fathers. He said we've gone from a time in which we lionized fathers, the TV show Father Knows Best, to even ridiculing them as incompetent. The Simpsons, American Dad, Family Guy, you can make the list. And as a result, you end up with less respect. Then he quotes from Dr. Emerson Eldridge, who's been on this program in his book, Love and Respect, talks about the fact that men need to be respected. And if we disrespect fathers, they're even less likely to get involved in the lives of their children. And so then gives us some quotes from the whole issue of fatherhood in the inner city, and just really saying that we should begin emphasizing once again family creation. We should be encouraging family creation, not discouraging it. And we should do what we can to try to build strong families. And so he has some things to say about whether or not we should have a welfare program that would punish a woman who wants to keep the man in her life. But I think as Christians, we also should simply say, maybe it's just time for pastors and Bible teachers and the rest to talk about the importance of families. And there's always a hesitancy. I noticed that churches used to speak out against divorce until they had too many divorced people in the congregation. They said, well, we're not going to talk about divorce. And the same thing here. As soon as we start seeing that there aren't as many individuals who have two-parent homes, we'll stop talking about the importance of two-parent homes. Yet oftentimes the people that are single moms are saying, I really wish you had focused on that, and that is certainly the case. But just before we take a break, let me take another piece that I didn't post, but it was very helpful to take the father issue to the conversation we're going to have in about 20 minutes. And that is, Kitty Kiefer said, fathers matter. A child without a good father figure grows up with a disadvantage that cannot be erased by money, education, or fame. And then talks about the fact that if you look at the latest statistics, and this comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who keep track of this, 69%, or almost 7 out of every 10 black children are born to unmarried mothers, which is just like off the charts. If you want to even look at the so-called non-Hispanic white category, that's 28%, which is still high, but nothing like that. And so, again, the CDC statistics account for the mother's marital status at the time of birth. Sometimes mothers marry later on, so that's certainly the case, but also sometimes fathers who were involved leave. And so what you end up having is the best statistics we have. And again, these are pretty well documented because of the Census Bureau, because of the CDC and others. Black children grow up and become teenagers. By the time they become teenagers, 54% or a majority of them never experience life in a household with two parents. So it isn't just that they were there for a while and then left. In many cases, a majority, they were never there in the first place. And so again, when you start looking at some of those issues, you can begin to say, well, there are some positive examples. We can go to Pew Research, for example, and studied American households with children under the age of 8, and they found that the living arrangements of black children stand in stark contrast to the other major ethnic groups. The majority, in that case, 54%, are living with single parents. So if you go out of even the category of African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, Anglo American, we're doing better there, but the chronic issue tends to be the need for black fathers in the home. And again, one more quote, and this comes from Walter Williams, who is an economist, but an African-American who's probably written on this as much as anybody. In his book, Race and Economics, he says, today's arguments that slavery and discrimination decimated the black family, that's not the case. He says, years ago, there were only slight differences in family structure between racial groups. The percentage of families that were nuclear, blacks were 75%, Irish 82%, German 84%, even Native white American 73%. The change took place once in some respects, back to the point that was made by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that indeed we have instituted a program, a welfare program that basically broke families apart and pushed fathers out of the home. And as a result, we have the kind of results that Daniel Patrick Moynihan was predicting way back in the 1960s as an individual who was trying to, at that time, warn Lyndon Johnson. So here you have a Democrat, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later, of course, became the senior U.S. senator from New York, but at the time trying to warn back in 1965 what might indeed happen. And, of course, he has been as prophetic as you might say, as an Old Testament prophet. So if we want to solve some of the problems of race and some of the problems facing the African American community, certainly next hour we're going to talk about, racial stereotypes, discrimination, need for racial reconciliation. But one of the biggest issues relates to what happened yesterday, Father's Day. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention, next hour we're going to be talking with our good friend Will Ford, who's been in studio with us before. Going to talk about the need for racial reconciliation, talk about what we can do to reach across any kind of racial tensions or barriers to make a difference. But at the same time, as I will mention in just a minute, we need to have some level of discernment to recognize that there are individuals who really want to go far beyond trying to address the racial issue and want to try to completely reconstruct America. But a good illustration of that, before I get to that, comes with the latest number of statues taken down. And it has been kind of interesting because the other day somebody said, "Are you going to talk about pulling down the Christopher Columbus statue in Portland?" I said, "Yeah, we'd mentioned it once and we didn't get back to it again." But some of the latest ones have been even more puzzling. And for example, if you go to San Francisco, one of the statues pulled down was Father Junipero Serra. Now, I don't know how you call him a colonizer or anything of the sort, but nevertheless, a very important figure in California history. But that one was taken down. I guess you could somehow justify that, but nevertheless, that really doesn't need any justification, as we have found. Another one pulled down, of course, was Francis Scott Key. You might say, who's that? Hopefully some of you know that he was the one that wrote the lyrics to the Star-Spangled Banner. There is nothing to indicate that he in any way was an oppressor or a slave owner or anything of the sort. As a matter of fact, was trying to negotiate the release of prisoners at the time in which he ended up writing what came to be known as our national anthem. And the one that even today somebody mentioned, did you see that they took down and destroyed the statue of Ulysses S. Grant, U.S. Grant, who was the 18th president of the United States? I love this piece here because one of the commentators was saying, the attack on U.S. Grant, or President Grant, was perhaps the one that left people most stupefied and disturbed, since Grant was largely the person responsible for the Union winning the war, putting an end to slavery. He also advocated for the 15th Amendment and signed the law that helped crush the KKK in its original form. Grant was lauded by none other than Frederick Douglass. At least I hope you know who that is. After a while, it's like you'll have to educate us on all of that. As the champion of the oppressed and honored in black churches when he died. Okay, so he's pulled down because, well, we just don't know anything about history. There was one that to me was even more of a head scratcher, and that is they pulled down the statue of Miguel de Cervantes. Now, you should know that name, but again, I recognize some never studied Don Quixote in school. I actually did quite a long essay on Don Quixote, and I've read all of it in English and even a little of it in Spanish. But nevertheless, Miguel de Cervantes was one of the statues that got hit and defaced, perhaps because they thought, well, it's a Spanish name, so that's bad enough, okay? Except here's the rest of it. Cervantes was a slave himself. Yes, he was a slave captured by the Barbary pirates. You might remember eventually we sort of had a war against the Barbary pirates and sent the Marines to the shores of what? Tripoli. And nevertheless, he was enslaved in the galleys in Algiers and eventually was ransomed out. So here we not only are not taking down a statue of a slave owner, we're taking down a statue of a slave itself. And the only explanation anybody could come up with is maybe because it was a Spanish name. Well, then that's got to be bad. And this one also led to a little bit of tension, too, because the embassy from Spain wrote this. It is also with great regret that we receive the news of the damages inflicted upon the bust of Miguel de Cervantes, who was himself held as a slave in Algiers for 5 years, and whose literature serves as a call for freedom and equality. We're not dealing with people here that are making rational decisions. We're dealing with people descending into anarchy and insanity, and that is certainly the case. One of the things I do want to talk about with Will Ford next hour is one of the other articles we've posted, because over the last 2 weeks, I've posted occasionally some information about the movement Black Lives Matter. Now, does the phrase Black Lives Matter mean something? Yes. Is that something we can endorse? Yes. But does the movement have a very nefarious agenda? Of course it does. And that is easily demonstrated by the individuals. Matter of fact, the article that I posted last week, and I posted 2 articles the previous week, are very honest and upfront about that. And even more recently, if you want to read this in its entirety, because I'm going to maybe go through it fairly quickly, we've had the founders, or at least one of the founders of Black Lives Matter movement, Patrice Cuellar, who actually admitted that they're trained Marxists. Now, last week we talked about that. You might even remember Dinesh D'Souza bringing that up, and some others have as well. But here's the direct quote, and if you find yourself saying, I want to read it for myself, that's why we post these articles for you on the website. Her quote is, I think that the criticism is helpful. I think the first thing we do is to have an ideological framework. Myself and Alicia, in particular, those are the 2 founders, are trained organizers. We're trained Marxists. We are super versed in ideological theories. So again, when we refer to them as Marxists, we do so because they call themselves Marxists. For a while, we had Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When we say, well, she's a socialist, people said, well, you call her a socialist. And I said, no, she calls herself a socialist, okay? In the same way, the founders of Black Lives Matter movement are trained Marxists. Those are their words. Then on another segment, by the way, that segment was from the Real News Now, but another segment with CNN and Jake Tapper, she went on to say in a different interview, I'm hands down, not only Trump needs to not be in office, that's a double negative, but basically, but that Trump should be resigning right now. Trump needs to be out of office, she says. He's not fit for office, so we're going to push for it to move to get, and some of the grammar's not perfect here, to continue to push and press on Vice President Joe Biden around his policies and his relationship to black policing and criminalization. That's going to be important for our goal to get Trump out. You can, again, read it. This goes on for 2 pages and talks about the goals that they have for 2020 in terms of trying to use the electoral process to remove Donald Trump, although the website doesn't say that they're endorsing Joe Biden and working for the defeat of Donald Trump. You have those interviews there as well. So we do provide this because from time to time, well-meaning people have said, well, I'm concerned about Black lives and Black lives do matter, and so I'm going to send money to Black Lives Matter movement, which is not something I would suggest, if you read any of these quotes, are things that you as Christians should support. But read it for yourself. That's why we put those up there on the website for you to read them. We come back from the break, though, we're going to talk about this whole issue of racial reconciliation. We've had Will Ford on the show with us before. First, I want to have him tell the story of his great-great-great-grandparents and the bowl that he oftentimes carries, which was passed down, and it's the bowl that they would put upside down and pray in so that the slave masters wouldn't know that they were praying. And he's got some incredible story about that. But then what can we do to actually reach out and bring about racial reconciliation? And what can the churches do? What can Christian organizations do? And tomorrow we're going to talk about as well a very significant statement which has been signed by lots of Christian leaders, mostly seminary professors and presidents and those kinds of things about this. So this is a topic we'll be looking at all through the week. And then in the last hour, we're going to change topics again. Maybe we'll get back into the subject of spiritual warfare, because I think some of that's taken place too. And Michael Heiser will be talking about demons, and we'll get into all of those conversations as well. If you'd like to know a little bit more, if you'd like to read the articles we're quoting from, they're on the website right now, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after these important messages.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today on this Monday. We're going to spend some time, obviously, focusing on this subject of racial reconciliation. If you were listening on Friday, I said our good friend Will Ford would be back in studio with us. And if you say, name sounds familiar, or maybe some of you say, wait a minute, is that the one with the story? Yeah. Some of you may just want to get something to write with right now, because we had a wonderful program a number of months ago. It was re-aired, so the easiest one to find is go to Point of View, go to January 20th, and you'll see Will Ford and Matt Lockett. Yeah. And for that entire hour, Will's in studio, Matt by phone, talking about the prayer bowl, which I'm going to have you do again, just in case some people haven't heard the story, and then talking about the need for revival and to deal with the racial wounds. And you've really been dealing with it more than just the black-white issue. We're going to get into some more of that as well. But first of all, let me give a formal introduction. We have, again, Will Ford III. He is the director and also the chair of Marketplace Leadership, Christ for the Nations. He is one of the founders of Dream Stream Company. We also have a link to his website as well. So we've got a couple of links that you can follow. And as you do, that will be the case. He's the leader of this prayer movement using this prayer bowl, Revelation 5:8, right? Right. As the kind of the catalyst for praying, for intercession, and the rest. And if nothing else, I guess if you will prevail upon me to ask one more time, Will, it's such an incredible story. Tell the story of that prayer bowl, because it really gives us a sense of why we're dealing with some of these racial issues.
You know, and then also at the same time, that kettle gives me hope. It does. And for those who hadn't heard the story, I have this about 200-year-old kettle pot that's been in my family. It's been passed down for about 7 generations. It was used by the slaves in my family.
Yes.
It was passed down because they used it for cooking, but secretly they used it for prayer. So those of you who studied anything about the peculiar institution called slavery, they wanted slaves to be Christians back then because they knew that Christian slaves made better workers. But they would pervert the gospel and say, slaves, be obedient to your masters if you want to go to heaven. Now, we know we're saved by grace through faith. It's not of works. It's a gift of God so that no one should boast. But it was easy to teach slaves that back then because it was against the law for slaves to read and write. It was also against the law for anybody to teach them how to read and write. But the irony is that this particular slave master and others, they didn't want them to pray. One, they were afraid, of course, of insurrections. But then two, they also were afraid of people getting hope. If they got hopeful, they thought maybe they'd try to run away. So this man and this plantation, this overseer, they would literally beat the slaves if they heard them praying. But my forefathers, they're in Lake Providence, Louisiana, my father's side of the family, where this kettle comes from, they decided to pray anyway. They were Christians and they loved Jesus, and so they went ahead and prayed. So what they would do is they sneak into a barn late at night to make sure their prayer meeting wasn't seen. But to make sure it wasn't heard, they used this cast iron kettle pot. They'd take it into the middle of the barn, and they would invert it. They'd turn it upside down, and prop it up with rocks so it would be suspended off the ground about 1 inch or 2. They would then prostrate themselves on the ground and put their lips between the opening between the ground and the kettle so that the kettle pot muffled their voices as they prayed through the night. And the story that was passed down with the pot is that they didn't think they would see freedom in their time, so they prayed for the freedom of their children and the next generation. So one day freedom comes, this young teenage girl decides to keep that pot and that story in our family. She passed it on to Harriet Lockett, who passed it on to Noah Lockett, who passed it on to William Ford Sr., William Ford Jr., who then gave it to me, William Ford III. So I've been taking that pot around the country to remind people that, listen, everybody has a prayer bowl in their family. Like my family, they use that pot just to muffle their voices, but literally Revelation 5:8 says there's bowls in heaven full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. There's a prayer bowl over our families. There's a prayer bowl over our communities. There's a prayer bowl over our nation. God's looking for a new generation of people to resource those prayer bowls once again. Because it wasn't just the prayers of black Christian slaves, they're also the prayers of white Christian abolitionists who knew that if any person was a slave, was a Christian, they knew that person was their brother. Those white abolitionists had their houses burned. They were tarred and feathered. They were even lynched because they chose to suffer with the people of God rather than compromise and wink at slavery. And so it was the prayers of that godly remnant of people, black and white, back then, who prayed into being the first or second Great Awakening. Had it not been for those revivals, slavery wouldn't have ended. So that's a little bit about the story there. And just to give you the rest of the story a little bit, here's what happens. I had this dream about Martin Luther King, which I may share a little bit later in the hour, but God dealt with me about my unforgiveness issues with the white community. I had a friend ask me to share that at the Lincoln Memorial on MLK Day for a prayer meeting. Well, there was a white guy who had a dream about the event and met somebody in the dream he never heard before named Lou Engle. So he decides to come to that event. We became friends. And me and that friend, Matt Locker, we've been friends for about 16 years. Well, fast forward 5 years ago, he finds out that the Civil War ended in his family's front yard. So we thought, what a cool coincidence. I have this kettle pot where slaves pray for freedom. You have this house where General Lee fought his last battle. We thought, what a cool coincidence. But then we stumbled on more research, and we learned that it was Matt Locker's family who owned my family, where that kettle pot came from.
Unbelievable. And
we met at the Lincoln Memorial, both led by dreams, to the place where Dr. King said, and I have a dream speech, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood.
It is just an incredible story. And again, if you want to hear it in its entirety, because we go into some more detail, including Matt Lockett's family, that I think, didn't they design the Confederate flag?
They designed the Confederate flag.
The stories that come out of this.
But then he also had abolitionists in the family, too, who was a circuit rider with Asbury. So it's amazing. Amazing story. Yeah.
But I think, again, just the fact that these two men, black and white, meet at MLK Day in Lincoln Memorial, travel for years talking about racial reconciliation, and then one day you find out, wait a minute, your great-great-grandparents owned my great-great-grandparents. Right. And then you had to kind of struggle through that again, didn't you?
It was, honestly, Kirby, it was because I have a great relationship with Matt and his family. I love him, he and Kim and his kids, but now all of a sudden, after sharing that story of the kettle and even how slave forefathers of my family were beaten, now I had a face connected to that, and it was connected to a face of somebody that I loved, right? Yes. So now I'm trying to forget how my friend was ever my enemy, and so at least my family's enemy. So I had to deal with that, and so I'm glad I had the just good people around me and a great relationship with him for 10 years. We walked through that. And then for him, it was the first time that he'd ever really connected to the story of slavery in such a way to where, oh, hold up, my family literally owned slaves. And he's looking at me now, it's like his family owned my family. And so for a year and a half before we were found out about the abolitionists in his family, it was a wrestling for him because he had been maybe a little bit dismissive of the pain of the community. And now that story is connected to the face of somebody he's in a relationship with. So it's an amazing relationship dynamic that we had and how we worked through it all, more personally instead of together, but we did talk through it a lot. But for the past 5-6 years, we've been sharing our story together, and we've seen a lot of healing come across the country.
Well, we need a lot of healing right now.
Yes.
And so when we come back, we're going to talk about racial divisions.
Yes.
And we'll talk about black-white, but I know you've also been working with anti-Semitism and even some issues in the Asian American community because some people have blamed Asians for coronavirus and just all sorts of inappropriate things. So we will certainly focus primarily on the African American community, but we're going to broaden this to look at racial issues. And again, matter of fact, we have a booklet, of course, on anti-Semitism, which has been out, and the new book here on racism. So these are some resources that we try to make available. And, of course, I hope that as we open up the phones, if you have some comments for Will Ford, I'm sure he would love to hear from those of you as well. So the number is 1-800-351-1212. We're going to talk about what he's been doing to bring about racial reconciliation and what we can do in our churches and in our individual lives. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new documentary reminds us how intrusive social media can be in our lives and how personal privacy is quickly vanishing. Kyle Smith writes about this in a recent op-ed and mentions the documentary The Creepy Line. The name of the documentary is taken from a comment by Google CEO Eric Schmidt. He has a nickname for the invasive nature of his company. He says Google policy on a lot of things is to get right up to the creepy line and not cross it. In the film, Peter Schweitzer illustrates how your search history gives Google an enormous amount of information. Of course, this is supposed to tell Google and other advertisers what you like to buy. But this enormous cache of information also tells anyone who has access to all of it all sorts of things about you and your personal taste. Google also has noticed that you would leave the search engine in order to surf the internet, so it developed the browser Chrome. That means that everything you do online through Chrome is also collected in this cache of information at Google. But that's not enough. Google wants to know what you're doing even when you're not online. So there's Android that uploads a complete picture of what you have been doing when you're not online. Smith concludes it's a surveillance business model. Google Maps, Google Docs, Gmail. Google knows more about you than your spouse does. Over the last few months, Congress has shown some interest in understanding how Google and other big tech firms make their editorial decisions. But Smith also reminds us that the federal government is a heavy user of Google products and has shown little interest in oversight. If Google isn't going to self-police itself, and if Congress isn't going to take any meaningful action, then we as consumers need to be wary of how Google and others use us and our information. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I see what is happening here is a teachable moment. That's exactly why we want to use this. We've talked about the issue of racial reconciliation many times with many individuals, including with Will Ford. But it does seem to me that there are some concrete things we can do about police brutality. We've talked about police unions. We even got into that again on Friday. We've talked about accountability, even talked about limited and qualified immunity and some things like that. Of course, we just, even an hour ago, we're talking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Civil Rights Act. But, Will, I think a lot of this just has to happen on the heart. You can't have laws change the heart.
You can't legislate the heart. That's exactly right. But laws are important to keep us as a society going in the right direction, and part of that whole normative ethic. But at the same time, you have to have the gospel get between that other side of the cavity of your chest there and just do something there. And prayer is key. Forgiveness is key. But yeah, we have to have a move of God right now. We really do.
What have you been trying to do to reach out? Because I know that this has been really a focus for years. And I want to just know, a lot of people are going to be sitting here today and saying, we want to listen, and we want to hear. And we want to hear what are the pains, what are the difficulties, what are the racial stereotypes, and most importantly, what are the solutions? So help us out with that.
The thing I've learned with dealing with the race issue is that everybody has blind spots. Even the best of us have blind spots when it comes to dealing with this. And I had my own, honestly. for the past 4 months, I haven't been dealing with black-white police issues. So that's important. And what happened with George Floyd is horrific. The whole thing that happened with Ahmaud Arbery as well. But before then, I've been working with the Asian community.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as the coronavirus hit, a lot of people have realized it, but the Asian community has come under significant attack. Asian Americans have been attacked verbally and literally. For example, in Lubbock, Texas, there was a man, I don't know what Lubbock, I believe it was Odessa area, but there was a man who, a white man took a knife to an Asian family simply because they were Asian, blamed them for bringing in the coronavirus.
Wow.
And stabbed one of the 2-year-old little boy, had a gash on his head, and they have pictures of it online. That's happened. But then as I spent time talking with that community and meeting with pastors and leaders of the Asian community, whether they were Chinese or Japanese or Korean, I've been finding out that 70% of the attacks coming against them have been coming from African-American people.
Wow.
Which is why I wanted to intervene to spend time in
Good for
prayer
you.
and healing. Yeah. So I've been doing that. And here's what I've been learning. I mean, I feel like a white guy talking to a black guy trying to do racial reconciliation for the first time. And like, you guys come to us and you say, I'm just here to learn. And I may say some things awkward in the beginning. And I was ask for forgiveness in advance, if I say the wrong thing. I've been doing that with the
Asians?
Yeah, with Asians.
I can believe it.
And here's what I've learned amazing things like how, the Chinese, when they first came to America, many of them came to America not just to do railroads, but also to pick cotton in Mississippi with African Americans shortly after slavery was over.
Yeah.
And I was blown away by how both the communities, African American and the Chinese, work together. They're in the Mississippi Delta area. There's a great movie that's coming out about it called Far East Deep South that a new friend of mine is putting out. But so I'm learning all this history and learning about the Chinese Exclusionary Act. I didn't know anything about that. I never read about it in any history books when I was in college or anything else. So what I'm saying is there are other communities in America that have this amazing story of how God brought them here and the way that we've all been enmeshed into this amazing melting pot called America. But there's a God storyline of how he's bringing us all together through this unity, through diversity, to be this amazing United States of America, one nation under God. So I like to look at it like that because there's a meta-narrative where God is bringing us all together. And but we all have come here with our different struggles in one shape, fashion, or form. And it's good to have an open mind to see just the struggle of other communities and how God has brought them up as well.
That's good. One of the things I have seen a lot of people starting to say is instead of turning my back on my heritage, I want to include that into that heritage. Yes. So whether it's Asian or certainly Hispanic or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. But I thought just since we're broadening it for a second, let's broaden it one more time. And that is this issue of hate crimes. Because if you look at the number on hate crimes, those have gone up over the last year or two.
Right.
But almost half of them, and I may be off, and maybe more than half of them now, are anti-Semitism. What's that all about?
Yeah, same thing. I've been working on that too. Right before I was dealing with the Asian conflicts, I've been meeting a lot with Orthodox rabbis, Messianic Jewish rabbis, and working with, starting the conversation with them as well. Right around Christmas time, there around the Feast of Lights, Hanukkah, there was a Orthodox rabbi in his home there in New York, and African-American man under the influence of this cult that's really taken the inner cities by storm right now, the Hebrew Israelites, rushes in there with a machete and hacks him to death with that machete. He stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks, but then eventually he passed away. And also there was a shooting at Kosher Deli in New Jersey where 4 people were shot and killed. Yeah. And so anti-Semitism is on the rise. You see the finger pointing with the coronavirus at the Asian community. And now the enemy's raising up this conflict, stirring up this conflict between police and African Americans. And now it's turned into this humongous racial tension. So here's the thing. The enemy is trying to raise up this nation rise against nation conflict. The word nation there, you all know, is the word ethnos. It's the ethnicity against ethnicity conflict. But I believe God's going to use the United Church to heal the division in the nation right now. But we have to show up. We have to be present. We have to be listeners in this hour. and be compassionate, show empathy, and listen to the stories of not just our community, but other communities.
A lot of that has to happen in the church. Tony Evans, who's been on this program many times before, and last time we had him on, he said, God isn't going to fix the White House until he fixes the church house. And if we don't fix the church house, forget about the White House. So what can we do in our churches? Are there some concrete steps that you would recommend to pastors and things of that nature?
Well, I think there are some things we need to do. First, we need to be in this posture of listening, where we listen to each other's stories and hear the things that people have gone through, not just in the African American community, but others. And right now, I think the hand of the Lord really is on trying to heal what's going on with the African American community right now with this issue in a pretty significant way. But be in a posture of listening, be in a posture of being ready to forgive, and then that's some pretty significant work. But then also getting out of our comfort zones. People in minority communities, we have to learn how to assimilate, in a sense, in culture with the dominant culture. But it's easy for people who are part of the dominant culture just to stay in a silo. They never have to have a conversation with a Black, Hispanic, or Asian person if they don't want to. But if they would take the step to move out beyond their comfort zones and just start conversations and just be ready to listen, it could be some of the greatest healing we could see come to this nation. And then taking the steps of, just getting actively involved and repenting along the way. That's what we need. That's what we all really need right now. Forgiveness and repentance running together. I believe God wants to release a forgiveness revival. That's what I believe.
Yes. Let's take a break, and when we come back, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Will Ford, we have information about him on the website. And let's take some phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And I'd love to know what you are doing in your particular circumstances. It could be that you're in a church and you're working through that. It could be you're working through your community. This has been a difficult time, first because of the pandemic, then because of the protests. And if I can pick one more P, it's also during a presidential election and time of political turmoil. So some of these things get completely misinterpreted and misused and used for various ends. So I'd love to know your thoughts about that. And we'll come back. I think I have a caller here from Massachusetts wants to start us off, so we'll get into that conversation. And again, if you find yourself saying, I'd really like to hear that whole story about Will Ford and Matt Lockett, you can find a couple of them, but the most recent one, I think we rebroadcasted, I think was on January 20th. And you can either type in Will Ford or Matt Lockett on the search engine there, or just simply scroll down. You might be able to find it on the YouTube channel, or certainly just download it as a podcast, and it will be amazing because we gave you the very short version of it, but it is even more incredible to hear the rest of the story, and certainly do commend it to you. I do believe we have a CD of it too, so if you want to write to somebody at Point of View, maybe they could give you a CD of it, but you can probably download it, and you all know how to do that, so that will be what we will suggest for you to do. And when we come back, we'll take some phone calls and give you a chance to join the conversation. Love to know what you're doing in your area of the world to try to bring about racial reconciliation. We'll be right back.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Will Ford in studio. If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to, I think it's Massachusetts. Tanya, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, hi, gentlemen. Just up front, let you know I have the gift of exhortation. It is my pleasure to commend anyone doing work for the Lord, but this is so important, this bringing the races together. It breaks my heart. I was saved when I was 3 years old. We had a family in our town, probably the only one that was a black family, and the woman was a Baptist, and she talked to my mother for hours, and my mom went to church one night, got saved, came home, woke up all four of us children. I was 3 years old. I was the youngest. And Mom said, would you kids like to know Jesus? And so we all said, yes, yes. And, you know, it took. I knew who the Lord was that young. And I was getting ready when I was 5 years old for Sunday school, still preschool, and my daddy didn't know Jesus, and I wept the entire morning getting ready for Sunday school. But this woman's little black boy became my best friend. We went to kindergarten everywhere together, and it is so vital that people do raise children to love each other, and there's no difference. God made everyone on the planet, all these cultures. Mm-hmm. I've traveled the world, and every culture has so much beauty in it, and we're going to be in heaven together. So especially Christians better get used to different types of people. God designed their noses,
every nation
their
and every
eyes.
tribe and every language and things like that. Well, I'd love to get your comments about that, because in some respects, you know, can't we bring heaven on earth? You know, the kingdom of heaven has arrived. So talk about that. You know, I think she's got a good point there.
She does have a good point. You know, sometimes we get in these kind of talks and people say, well, you know, I don't see color. And I understand where they're coming from when they say that. But the deal is, if you say that I don't see color, for some people, that says to them, my color is so bad to you that you
don't even see it.
Yeah, you have to look past it. You have to concentrate and really look past it, because you think the way I've made is so bad. And when you think of it, at the end of the day, it's this almost a Gnostic kind of thing where, you know, all matter is evil, everything unseen is divine. That kind of creeps in a sense, where people start thinking like that. And the deal is, God made all of our skin. He made all matter. He made the seen and the unseen. So what I'm saying is, it's all good. It's all good. The color of the skin is good. No color of skin is better than the other one. And God made this thing so that there really can't be any real unity without diversity. You know, He didn't make us to be living bricks. He called us to be living stones as Christians. So 1 Peter 2:9, you know, with this chosen race, with this royal priesthood, with this holy nation, people of God's own possession, who proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness and into His marvelous light. We're not a people, now we are the people of God. So that word race there is the word genos in that verse. We say it was a chosen race. So that's the word for genes. That's where we get that word from. Jesus used that word in Revelation 22 to say that we're the offspring of David. And then later on, He says that we're a holy nation. It's the word ethnos, where we get the word ethnicity. So listen, it's offspring of Father God. We're on racial identity as believers.
Yes.
And so, but when we come together in unity, that kind of agreement, powerful stuff happens. So stonemasons putting together a house, when you see them putting together a house, they have to take one stone and get another one and fitly connect it and frame it to the next one. Brick masons, not so much. They just kind of everything's uniform. They just slap them on. But that's what God is doing with this spiritual house. He's bringing out this beautiful mosaic, unity through diversity, different tribes, different tongues, different languages. John the Revelator and Daniel both saw it when they had their heavenly encounters. People of all different races, languages, tribes there, different colors, ethnicities. He saw it all there. So on earth as it is in heaven, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad Tanya brought it up, because it got us right to what I knew you probably wanted to talk about, and that is this idea of different races and the rest. Let me come back to something you did mention, and that is we're sometimes in our silos. And in my book here, a booklet I've got, for example, we'll look at Pew Research, and this shows the difference between the way African Americans and Anglo Americans, between black and white, see this. More than 7 in 10 blacks believe that race relations in the United States are generally bad, only 56% of whites. So very, very different as well. And interestingly enough, this is one of the most sad statistics out of Pew Research. Half of all blacks are convinced that black people will never have equal rights. I mean, that's a sad, sad perspective on that. But let's go to the Christian realm, because even Barna Research has found that more than 8 in 10, or 84%, blacks believe that people of color are often put at a social disadvantage because of their race, while just a bare majority of evangelicals, 56%, see that. So part of the dealing with racial reconciliation is being able to see some things from a different point of view.
Yes.
You've heard the old Indian line of walking in someone else's moccasins. So it does seem to me that Tanya was very fortunate growing up in Massachusetts. Not a lot of African Americans up there. I've been up in Maine, and they say there may be more black bear up there than there are black people up there. So in some places you have no contact. But what's the most segregated institution Sunday at 11 o'clock?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So we have to go beyond our comfort zone. Speak to that, or maybe how we could do that.
Well, this has to be intentional.
Yeah.
It has to be intentional. And reaching out to your neighbor. You start right there in your own neighborhood.
For sure.
And then, but also inviting people over for dinner and just having those conversations and staying in the same room with each other. I was looking at Pentecost this last one, Pentecost in the middle of all the pandemic. And I thought about the whole thing of quarantine.
There you go.
And how Jesus appeared to 500 people, after he was resurrected for 40 days. But only 120 showed up at the upper room. And you think, okay, 380 people, what happened to the 380? And you do the math, right? Well, the 380, either they stayed in the upper room and they left before the outpouring, or they opted out. And I'm thinking, why would they do that after being in quarantine? I'm thinking, probably because they didn't want to be quarantined.
Yes.
I'm thinking, my kids right now, they're probably sick of me. They were sick of me after 2 days of quarantine.
Yes.
But the thing is, here you have people of all different languages, right, in the same room. So think about it. In America, the OK sign is one thing, but in Brazil, it means something totally different.
Yeah. Well, so some people say it's white supremacist now if you do that.
Oh, God, I didn't know. I haven't heard that one, Kerby. You threw another one at me.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, you just go, and you don't give a thumbs up, because that sometimes means something different.
That may something different. So all these people, different languages in the same room, so they had to do gestures, and they probably offended somebody along the way. Then scholars said there actually were people in the room who were from different warring nations that were part of that upper room company. So these people trying to communicate with each other, trying to get on the same page with each other, and they were there for 10 days. But beautiful thing happened. A friend of mine, Jonathan Tremaine Thomas, said this to me about 5 years ago. We were talking in the hotel lobby one day, and he said, I just was reading the book of Acts account about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. He said, it finally dawned on me. The most beautiful thing that happened was that when the outpouring of the Holy Spirit happened, for the first time, these people could understand one another.
Yes. Language-wise, but also culture-wise.
Culture-wise and everything. And I feel like God is saying right now to the church, stay in the room.
Yeah, stay in the room.
Stay in the room. Stay in the room through all those crazy posts that you're seeing on Facebook. Your friend is posting. You can't believe why they're saying that. Stay in the room where people are throwing up hashtags and stuff, and you're like, why would they even connect themselves at? Stay in the room when you see people verbalizing things and saying stuff on the outside for the first time that they've been holding inside for a while. Stay in the room. I think if we could stay in the room right now, through all of the fray and all the things that are going on right now, we could stay in the room long enough, we could be a part of an epic outpouring.
I think so.
That could change the world.
I've oftentimes said that if you ever turn the microphone on during the breaks, we have some great conversations. And one of them is that we were talking about Tasha Morrison.
Yes.
And the bridge to racial unity. So that may be a resource, or some others.
I think it's an amazing resource.
Yeah, go for it.
I was turned on to her book by a few people in the middle of writing mine, but then I finally got a chance to dive into it. It's an amazing resource, I believe, for churches to have the uncomfortable conversations. And they have a whole support team, support network connected to
Discussion guides, everything.
Discussion guides, everything. And I haven't met her, but shameless plug for her work, and I'm very excited about what she's doing.
Well, just again, people are looking for all sorts of resources
yes.
and links. And first of all, can they go maybe to Dreamstream Company, find some things?
Yes,
and
most
you're
definitely.
coming out of quarantine, so I think we've got to get you out on the road speaking again. You think that's a possibility?
That's
okay, so that's
happening,
one of them. And when I come back, we've been in Massachusetts. Let's go to Michigan next, and we'll do that. But we have one of those mandatory breaks. We come back, though, I thought I might also just talk about, the Bible talks about the fact that we're all of one blood, and
Yes.
what that means in Acts 17. The Bible admonishes us not to feel superior to anyone, so whether that's a racial issue, an ethnic issue, a cultural issue, even a political, Republicans, Democrats, all that, and so we'll talk about that and how we should never really show favoritism even inside the church. So these are principles where some of you are probably thinking, well, does the Bible say that much about race? Well, I've got a chapter in my book on Christian ethics, and we've got a whole booklet on it. So, yeah, there's a few verses there if we could get
most
to.
definitely.
So we'll do that as well. So we'll take a phone call. We'll talk about some of these principles to really begin to respond to racial inferiority, racial superiority, discrimination, and a variety of other things. It brings us really back to humility, which we'll talk about right after the break.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're with us for a few more minutes. Let's head out to Michigan this time. Vernon, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, sir.
What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I when I was growing up, I was in Michigan, and I was very young. But in the little towns around the state, there were what they called widow walks on top of the house.
I'm not sure what that is. But if nothing else, I just appreciate that. And if nothing else, just want to encourage people to think what they can to make a difference. And, just a minute ago, we were talking off air. So, again, some of the best conversations are off air. Yeah. When you think about trying to bridge a gap, you see that with Jesus going into Samaria. Yeah. I imagine a few of our listeners have even watched The Chosen. Yes. And if you watch The Chosen, there's one point where all the disciples going this way and Jesus going this way. And go, why are we going there? Well, we're going to Samaria. No, we don't want to go to Samaria and meet the woman at the well in Samaria. But Jesus wanted to make sure that very quickly he established that indeed there would be a bridging of a very significant gap between the Jews and the Samaritans.
Yeah, exactly. Back during that time, of course, Jesus is trying to go into the festival, whatever that was going on, and the Samaritans and Jews had this horrible racial and religious conflict with each other. But Jesus reached out to the Samaritans often. So he reached out to the woman at the well, and I think he'd actually made some headway at this point in the area. So he sends 2 disciples to see if he could cut through that village, that Samaritan village, to go to where he was going. And it's interesting, in my neighborhood growing up back in the day, I couldn't cut through certain neighborhoods.
Yeah. Oh, I know that.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, whether it's African American, wasn't gangs, a lot of gangs when I was growing up.
Not the Bloods and Crips, but just still was Italian or Polish or whatever.
Yeah, I couldn't cut through a certain neighborhood at a certain time of night.
I know what you're talking about.
Right. But then also, too, Jesus says, well, that's basically what he experienced. He couldn't cut through that neighborhood right at that time. So the disciples said something that was interesting. They said, you want us to call down fire from heaven and just destroy this place? They were that enraged because Jesus was experiencing racism. Like, I can't believe these racists. Let's burn this place down. And Jesus said something that was so profound. He said, the Son of Man didn't come to destroy man's lives, but to save them. But then he also said this, you don't know what spirit you're speaking from. In other words, you don't know what spirit you're speaking from. You may think you want justice, but really you want revenge. You don't know what spirit you're speaking from. But then Kerby didn't stop there. Of course, this reminds us of all the riots and everything. There's some great good protesters who are protesting. There are people down there praying, but there are rioters and there are looters. And honestly, some of the folks down there don't know what spirit they're speaking from right now. We need to pray because the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God in the least bit. But Jesus didn't that wasn't a one-off with that whole encounter. He remembers this encounter because after he has that, experiences the racism there and tells the disciples not to call down fire from heaven, he then gives the 72 authority to cast out demons. And then somebody comes back and says, you know what? I saw Satan fall like lightning. And Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning. But then something else happens. While the heavens are opened up and the spiritual climate has shifted, a lawyer comes to Jesus and asks him, who's my neighbor? And Jesus says, oh, who's your neighbor? Let me tell you this story about not a racist Samaritan, because he just experienced racism, right? He said, no, let me tell you a story about a good Samaritan. It's like, hold up, Jesus, didn't you just experience racism from the Samaritans? Why would you tell a story about a good Samaritan? He said, no, while the heavens are opened up, while things have shifted here, I hadn't forgotten about what happened over there. So for these Jewish people, I'm going to destigmatize the very people that they cannot stand, and I'm going to tell the story about a good police officer. I'm sorry, a good black man. A good white. No, I'm going to tell the story about a good Samaritan. Why? Because I want to change the narrative, and that's what the church needs to do right now. Right. Through prayer and active engagement, we need to change the storyline. We take a sword to the heavens and take a towel to the earth, and we start to shift the storyline, shift the narrative, not negating what has happened, but we get actively involved, and we start telling the good stories about what God is doing in the midst of all the chaos.
You know, and again, one of the questions I think some people have is, well, if I'm a pastor or if I'm a Sunday school leader or something like that, you know, what do I talk about? And, you know, I just mentioned a minute ago in Acts 17, it says we're all of one blood. You know, we all go back to Adam and Eve, and we all recognize that what we see as significant racial differences genetically in terms of the human genome is nothing. We're all created in the image of God, so that would mean that if nothing else, racism is sinful and evil, and also that all are equal. And you see that quite a bit if you think about that, because, Colossians talks about there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, Scythian, barbarian, slave or free. And in my book, I talk about the fact that right there, you almost have the idea that really Paul removes all four distinctions.
Yep.
National distinctions, Greek or Jew.
Right.
Religious distinctions, circumcised or uncircumcised.
Yep.
Cultural distinctions, barbarian, Scythian. And economic distinctions, slave or free.
Yep.
So guess what? The ground is level at the foot of the cross.
It's level at the foot of the cross. And so for believers, I tell people this, before I'm African American, first and foremost, I'm a Christian in America.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you understand it. Before you're Anglo American, you're first and foremost a Christian American. If somebody's Hispanic and they're a believer, they're first and foremost. In other words, when we come together in that kind of unity and agreement in our identity in Christ, not negating our color or ethnicity, but that's our first and foremost understanding of who we are as kingdom citizens, how we conduct ourselves from that. It should inform everything that we do.
And it seems to me that, again, we should work to try to bridge the gap and try to establish the kind of basis upon which that can take place. Mm-hmm. And if some of our listeners say, I would like to have Will Ford come to my church and speak to this issue, or we need to have a conference to really talk about bridging the gap and bringing different congregations around the city together, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, you're available for that, aren't you?
Totally.
Yeah. So talk about what that would entail, because I certainly wanted, as we're coming out of quarantine, maybe we can get you back on the road. What do you think?
I would love to get back on the road, and I'm started last week, going back to churches and talking, doing a lot of Zoom meetings.
Yeah, I'm sure you are.
Yeah, all around the world. But just go to DreamStreamCompany.com. And there's a section on there to request myself and my friend Matt Lockett to come share our story. I love to do it with him, and we do it together because it's the story and the optics of this coming together, and just the presence of God that shows up when we share this story together is so powerful and it's so profound. It's amazing. And of course, if you want me to just come and speak on other topics, I teach on a lot of different things, everything from the marketplace to revival. You can go to willfordministries.com and you can reach out to me there for anything like that. But I'm really pushing the story with Matt and I right now, us coming together and sharing this. So if you can get several churches together, get the region together, call us out, go to DreamStreamCompany.com and go to the request to speak section there.
So again, if you click on your picture, that will take you to your ministry, and then we have a separate blowout one that says Dream Stream Company,
yes,
which will take you to that particular one, which is DreamStreamCO.com.
Exactly.
So we've got both of those on the website, and you can click probably either, but especially the one that I would encourage you to go to DreamStream, because then you can watch some of the videos and see the speakers, see the story,
yes,
see the kettle.
Yep,
which is kind of fun.
Yep.
You got to see the kettle, which is kind of fun. So anyway, it is always great to have you on the program. Let's do this again soon.
Most definitely. I would love to, sir.
I'd like to get you out on the road here, and then it's always hard to get you in. But as you're still a little bit in quarantine, was able to get you in studio. So God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you so much, Kerby.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some issues in the news. And if you think there's spiritual warfare, yes, before the next hour is over, we'll talk about spiritual warfare with Michael Heiser and demons. All that coming up right after this.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-51 51. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us again on this Monday edition here at Point of View. For this hour, we're going to do a couple things. First of all, I've posted a couple of articles that you need to see. One, which I really won't discuss, but it is a very good video to watch. Family leaders discuss the Supreme Court ruling. That's on the 1964 Civil Rights Act and how the definition of sex was changed from what everybody in 1964 knew sex meant, male and female, to sexual orientation and transgender, and the impact that that could have on everything from amateur athletics, high school athletics, boys saying they're girls and playing in girls' sports, to healthcare and a variety of others. We won't talk about that. But I thought one thing that I did want to focus on is yesterday was Father's Day. And there is a very good piece that we've posted. It is our second article there by Rick Santorum, former senator from the Keystone State of Pennsylvania. And I thought it would be appropriate, number one, because we didn't really say much about fathers. We're learning more than ever from social research how important fathers are at a time when fathers are seen as optional. And then in light of the conversation we've just had with Will Ford, one of the biggest challenges facing the African American community is the absence of fathers, which brings me to another piece we'll get to in just a minute. Katie Kiefer, Black Fathers Matter. And first of all, let's take the point with Rick Santorum, because I love how he starts out, and that is Father's Day yesterday was like no other. Due to the coronavirus shutdowns, thousands of dads in nursing homes weren't able to visit their children. Many kids and their moms will not be taking dad to his favorite restaurant. Grown sons and daughters living in hot areas are not traveling so dad can spend the weekend with his children and grandchildren. So in some respects, it has been a very unusual Father's Day, as it was an unusual Mother's Day. Then he goes on to remind us, though, that all the extensive research that is out there shows that the odds of successful life outcomes dramatically increase for children that have both a father and a mother in the home. Now, I recognize, and we've said on this program many times before, that single moms or single dads have a really tough time of it. But nevertheless, the evidence is very clear that children have better educational outcomes, better situations. They're less likely to show behavior problems, less likely to commit crimes, use dangerous drugs, on and on and on. List goes on for some time, and if you have even the slightest question about that, just look at these massive databases that have been put together by the Heritage Foundation, by the Family Research Council, and others that look at all sorts of refereed academic journals, which all come to the same conclusion, and that is kind of the biblical model of a father and a mother. That is ideal. Then points out that the fact is that now we have so many children, particularly in underprivileged homes, that are being deprived of a two-parent home, and quotes from Tucker Carlson, who said, you know, increasingly having a father at home is a sign of affluence, or maybe it's because of affluence. But anyway, the bottom line is this is a relatively recent phenomenon if you look over the last century or two, because even in 1960, as a quote from David Brooks in The Atlantic, 77% of children back in 1960 were living in two married parent homes. Now that's less than half. And so the tendency there for David Brooks, and sometimes we like his column, sometimes we don't, is, well, that was just kind of a freakish historical anomaly. But I love Rick Santorum saying, I think that's kind of defeatist. It seems to me, if anything, we should try to emphasize, especially in our churches, especially in our communities, the importance of family. And then points out that David Brooks does talk about forged families, where you have individuals through extended families fill the void. And of course, we've seen the impact that grandparents have had in families and communities, and even sometimes in churches, recognizing that if we have a single mom, let's see if we can get a dad involved in whether it's Awanas or Indian Guides or Boy Scouts or taking them to Promise Keepers or something like that. And he points out that part of the problem, of course, has been the academic and social movements have kind of marginalized all of these fathers. We went from a time in which culture sort of lionized fathers, TV show like Father Knows Best, to now really ridiculing them as incompetent, and that's The Simpsons and American Dad and Family Guy and all those kinds of things. And then we've even had government programs, which in many cases, which were implemented in the 60s, and I'll get into this in just a minute, maybe in the next part of our hour here, in which the government payments only went if fathers were absent, so it sort of drove fathers out of the home. And we'll get into that more in just a minute when I quote from this other article that talks about some of the warnings given out in 1965 by then liberal Democrat Daniel Patrick Moynihan, as he wrote to and expressed his concern to then Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. And later, of course, Daniel Patrick Moynihan became the senior senator from the state of New York. But nevertheless, that is something else that is of concern. And so, again, Rick Santorum goes out of his way to talk about the need to really show respect to these fathers. He says, do not underestimate the damage done by disrespecting fathers and fatherhood. Men, fathers, and future fathers need to be needed. And Dr. Emerson Edricks, who's been on this program with us before, talks about how men need to be respected. And yet we have really a culture that says fathers are optional, fathers are not necessary, or maybe fathers just need to be ridiculed. So that, of course, is the real significant issue. And then quotes from a book called Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Inner City, in which they looked at the personal stories of more than 100 black and white unmarried fathers in economically depressed sections of Philadelphia. The authors found widespread concern among these workers about whether they would support a family financially, and some openly even question whether the mothers of their children would want to be with them given their limited means. So again, this gets us into some of the real challenges that some men, younger men, both black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, that sometimes are facing that as well. And so there is a real need, he points out, to really help fathers in this regard. And also, finally, before we take a break, just to encourage family creation. That's something I think the culture should do. It is certainly something I think churches should do, and Christian organizations and marriage ministries and the right really need to do this, because if nothing else, if there's no encouragement to get married and to have a family, and if indeed you say, well, the government will take care of them, we're back to the same kind of issues that we faced here before. So if nothing else, he ends by talking about the fact that the Pro-Growth American Action Forum released a study this week on the benefits of paid family leave. So he talks about that as another possible benefit. But more importantly, I think it really brings it back to the fact that we can do some things economically to support families, to support fathers, and to support mothers. But the reality is a lot of this is on the backs of those of us at church. We need to talk about how families are important, how marriage is important, and we need to preach that more and more every single day, because it's almost counterculture to the messages being heard in the culture. Let's take a break, though. We'll talk about, when we come back, not only are fathers important, black fathers are very important as well. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A new documentary reminds us how intrusive social media can be in our lives and how personal privacy is quickly vanishing. Kyle Smith writes about this in a recent op-ed and mentions the documentary The Creepy Line. The name of the documentary is taken from a comment by Google CEO Eric Schmidt. He has a nickname for the invasive nature of his company. He says Google policy on a lot of things is to get right up to the creepy line and not cross it. In the film, Peter Schweitzer illustrates how your search history gives Google an enormous amount of information. Of course, this is supposed to tell Google and other advertisers what you like to buy. But this enormous cache of information also tells anyone who has access to all of it all sorts of things about you and your personal taste. Google also has noticed that you would leave the search engine in order to surf the internet, so it developed the browser Chrome. That means that everything you do online through Chrome is also collected in this cache of information at Google. But that's not enough. Google wants to know what you're doing even when you're not online. So there's Android that uploads a complete picture of what you have been doing when you're not online. Smith concludes it's a surveillance business model. Google Maps, Google Docs, Gmail. Google knows more about you than your spouse does. Over the last few months, Congress has shown some interest in understanding how Google and other big tech firms make their editorial decisions. But Smith also reminds us that the federal government is a heavy user of Google products and has shown little interest in oversight. If Google isn't going to self-police itself, and if Congress isn't going to take any meaningful action, then we as consumers need to be wary of how Google and others use us and our information. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to be spending just a few more minutes talking about the importance of fathers. And I might just as a program note mention that we'll then be talking about spiritual warfare. And if nothing else, this is one of the things we try to do so often on Point of View. Talk about some of these issues that are in the news, but give you a perspective that you're just never going to hear probably anywhere else. Even last hour, Will Ford, I think, did a very good job of helping us understand some of the spiritual issues underlying some of the racial tension in America. As we talk about this issue of the importance of black fathers, I mean, how many times have African American guests on this program, whether it's Walter Williams or whether it has been perhaps people like Tony Evans or a variety of others talk about the importance of that, or Larry Elder. You can go down the long list. I was just trying to come up with just a couple very quickly. Matter of fact, even Thomas Sowell, I love what Thomas Sowell says just the other day. He says, I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. So in some respects, if you're convinced that these policies that we have right now, the so-called war on poverty that goes back to the 1960s, if you think that's working, ask yourself how many people that are below the poverty line are African American after spending what some people estimate $23 to $25 trillion. Maybe there's something else that's missing. And I would suggest to you that one of those is something I just talked about, fathers. And Katie Kiefer puts it this way: fathers matter. A child with a good father figure grows up with without a good father, I should say, grows up with a disadvantage that cannot be erased by money, education, or fame. And again, their real significant issue is, let's look at some of the numbers. This comes from the Census Bureau. It comes from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that is 69% of African American children are born to unmarried mothers. Now, you might say, okay, well, they're born. Black children are born to unmarried mothers, but maybe later they get married. Okay, some do get married. But again, let's go back and look at those numbers. The best estimate are that by the time black children grow up and become teenagers, a majority, 54%, have never had an experience of a life in a household with two parents. Now, you might think, well, that's always been the case. No, it has not. And again, I just mentioned Walter Williams. Okay, Walter Williams, an economist, George Mason University, African American, and if nothing else, in his book on race and economics, talks about the fact that we hear so much about slavery and discrimination, but he says years ago there were only slight differences between family structure between racial groups. I'm giving you his direct quotes. The percentage in nuclear families, that would be husband, wife, kids, okay? Black, 75%, Irish, 82%, German, 84%, Native White American, 73%. Actually, if you look at it, compared to just a few of the ethnic groups like Irish and German, African American families were more likely to have a nuclear family than the white families. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, we won't go on from there. And then again, Katie Kiefer goes on to point out that major research shows that both the woman and the child fare better when the woman is married to the father when the child is born. A national representative Princeton University study overlapping both the Bush administration and the Obama administration highlighted in this book that 65% of unmarried couples were separated within 5 years after the birth of a child. Absence of a father took a toll on mothers and children. And if you don't think so, there have been so many research studies, so many books written about the impact of divorce and the impact of cohabitation, living together, and the whole issue of, I guess I can still use the phrase, out-of-wedlock births. Again, this should not have surprised anybody because I quoted earlier Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and here, this is the quote, that nevertheless, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his famous report in 1965, and you can look it up. It's got a title today we probably wouldn't use, but back then it was called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. Today we call it the Black Family or the African American Family. That's how it was worded back in 1965. He was a liberal Democrat. He was part of the administration telling the Lyndon Johnson administration that this war on poverty, by only providing benefits to women who did not have a man in the home, would actually split the family apart, and that's exactly what happened. With a predictability, if you will, of an Old Testament prophet, that is the case. I thought I'd read his quote here. Again, he uses the word Negro, which I know we don't tend to use today, but I just want to read it because that's how he wrote it. And he said, at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family. It is the fundamental source of weakness of the community at the present time. There's actually no single fact of Negro American life so little understood by whites. The American family is the basic social union of American life. It is the basic socializing unit. By and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. And he points out that basically this is what's going to happen. And of course, that's exactly what has happened. 3 times as many black children are born to unwed mothers compared to the rest of society, although the Anglo-American, Hispanic American populations are catching up, and that's not good for society at all. Just before we take a break, we get into this whole issue of spiritual warfare, because I think that's another thing that is maybe explaining a little bit of what's going on out on the streets today, which you probably won't hear on other broadcasts. Let me just give you the latest updates on all the statues being torn down. Gary Bauer says, fresh from toppling the statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the mobs now have gone after Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Another George Washington statue was destroyed. Of course, that one was the one that took place in Portland, Oregon. Then radicals went after Christopher Columbus and even Abraham Lincoln. For our friends out in California, of course, you can go to San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. They tore down the statue of Father Junipero Serra. which we studied when we grew up in California. Francis Scott Key, what does he have to do with anything other than the fact that he's the one that wrote the lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner? And one that somebody asked me about earlier today, Ulysses S. Grant. U.S. Grant was the 18th president of the United States. He was perhaps, as some people say in this article, the one that had most people confused because, after all, he is the person largely responsible for winning the war, the Civil War, that would be, for those of you that don't know much about history, and putting an end to slavery. He also is the one that advocated the 15th Amendment. Look it up. He also signed the law that helped crush the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, in its original form. When Grant did all of that, he was lauded by, again, the African-American Frederick Douglass as a champion of the oppressed. And when U.S. Grant died, he was actually honored in many of the black churches in both the South and the North. One last one I just had to put up there. One of the other statues taken down, Miguel de Cervantes. I hate to say it, but I got a feeling that some may not even know who he is. He is the author of one of the most famous works of Spain, and that is Don Quixote. But here is really confusing because Cervantes was a slave himself. He was captured by the Barbary pirates, enslaved in the galleys of Algiers for 5 years before finally someone was able to ransom him. The only thing I can think out is people know nothing about history and they saw a Spanish name, so got to come down. And this one created a small international incident. This comes from the Embassy of Spain. The Embassy of Spain said, "It is also with great regret that we receive the news of the damages inflicted upon the bust of Miguel de Cervantes, who himself was held as a slave in Algiers for 5 years and whose literature serves as a call for freedom and equality." The sad reality is that these statues are coming down right and left. It isn't even based upon anything rational, and if nothing else, shows kind of the irrational nature of what is taking place out there on the streets. We are going to see other statues coming down, ones that are just head scratchers, because after all, once you head down the road towards anarchy, there's really nothing to stop you. So when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about this whole idea of spiritual warfare and demons. Michael Heiser has a very good argument that maybe we haven't really looked at this idea of demonic oppression and possession, the issue of Satan is alive and well in the world, from at least the Old Testament perspective. So he's going to help us with that as well. But as we go to a break, let me also encourage you to click on the button there that says, "For such a time as this." Yeah, we're kind of like Esther. We find ourselves in a crazy time, a time of uncertainty. And if nothing else, I hope today you've heard some things you hear nowhere else. And if you have, maybe that's reason for you that between now and the end of our fiscal year to consider a gift to Point of View. So again, you can click on the button, you can click on the amount, and we would greatly appreciate your financial support. We're going to come back and talk about something you won't hear on CNN or MSNBC. What about this spiritual warfare? Is some of it happening in the streets? We'll be back right after this.
Have you ever said, well, it can't get any worse than this? Here in 2020, I've stopped saying that. Just when you think difficulties have to end, it's something else. Never has there been a more important time to get good information about what's really happening in the nation and the world. And that means never has there been a more important time to jump on board the Point of View Truth Team. You have a critical role to play in stemming the tide of evil and participating in the cause for good. We have been called together for such a time as this, and all it takes is just a few minutes to visit our website or call us and join the team. Do that today. June is the end of our fiscal year, a time we're looking at what we can do in the second half of the year with so many big events ahead. And we really need to know that you are with us in the fight. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. We cannot afford to be silent. It is time for action. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend some time talking about spiritual warfare and in particular demons. And we are so privileged to have Dr. Michael Heiser with us. It is a book that is very well recommended by Frank Turek. I think I've actually had a chance to hear some of the interviews they've done on Frank's program. It is a book called Demons. Now, Michael Heiser has written on a variety of other topics very similar, the unseen realm, supernatural, angels, and the rest. And he is certainly a scholar in the fields of biblical studies and the ancient Near East. He is a scholar in residence at Faith Life Corporation, which are the makers of Logos Bible software. How many times have we benefited from that and done interviews on that? Holds a PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Dr. Heiser, a privilege to have you on the program with us today.
Well, Kerby, before we even head into this, I should say it's a privilege to be on. I've used your material a lot.
Well, that's awful nice. I've used the Logos a lot, too. Yeah.
I mean, it's just so much good stuff, from Probe, and just wanted to say that.
Well, thank you. And I only have about a half an hour with you, but we can probably do a longer one in the future. But I just thought this would be so appropriate because a lot of people are wondering, there's turmoil in the streets, there's anarchy, there are people against each other, and there's a tendency to always see all of these conflicts is nothing more than human conflicts. And yet we recognize that as we look in the scriptures, there is a battle that is taking place in the heavenlies, and it manifests itself here on earth as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I tend to think, that we sort of lose sight of, really what we're looking at in Daniel 10. I mean, everybody seems to know this, who's sort of into, spiritual beings and demons and whatnot. This is Daniel's chapter where he talks about supernatural princes of Persia and Greece doing battle with Michael, who's the prince of Israel, and so on. But, when you think about it, Persia and Greece had human leadership. I mean, these are empires. So Daniel doesn't divorce his thinking from that. People of power, who have power and authority, to oppress others and more or less, just exact their will on other people. They're going to do that. But behind that, there is, according to Daniel, a supernatural intelligence. So, a lot of times we dichotomize these things, maybe not so much consciously, but, we look at what's going on around us and, that's bad stuff. Yet, we'll affirm, the belief in supernatural, powers of darkness. But Daniel marries those two things together, but we sort of lose sight of that when we are in times like this, and we zero in only on the human element, and so we're looking for political solutions and all this sort of stuff. When really, ultimately, what's going to matter is successful spiritual combat against these things. And that's really about changing hearts and minds through the Great Commission. I don't know if you've had the chance to read any of the book, but I linked spiritual warfare, frankly, because Paul does, to the success of the Great Commission. I think that is the biblical definition of spiritual warfare.
And again, tearing down strongholds and lofty thoughts raised up against the knowledge of God and taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Seems to me that how can you have evangelism if you always have obstacles to evangelism? So the connection makes sense to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, again, they won't hear that and hear anything new, but it's really nuanced in Paul in some interesting ways. For instance, there's half a dozen passages where Paul is talking about the resurrection. When we do that, it's like, oh, great, I get to be at my ideal weight, or, I'll look better, I got more hair, or whatever. We tend to physicalize this, and Paul, does some of that in 1 Corinthians 15, but half a dozen times he goes from the thought of the resurrection to another thought, and that is the nullification of the authority and power of the principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. You think, well, how in the world does he go from one to the other? And what's the significance of that? Because then he'll take that thought about their nullification, and he'll link that to his concept of the fullness of the Gentiles. which is an eschatological event that precedes the awakening of Israel, and then the end comes, the second coming. He links all these things together. And what it comes down to is that the greater the success of the Great Commission, this has everything to do with the transition from this age into the fullness of the age to come. And that leads to not only the nullification of hostile powers of darkness, but their ultimate destruction. And for Paul, all of these things fit together. So the way you deal with them, let me just ask the question. Your listeners could ask themselves the question about spiritual warfare. What is it that a supernatural power of darkness would fear? Well, he doesn't necessarily fear what you might do, or maybe a prayer you pray, or some music, or whatever. All these things are shouting in a building or in a room. This is how we sort of think of spiritual warfare. What they really fear is the end of their own existence.
Yes.
And that is linked to the day of the Lord, which again is linked to all these other things. So as the one kingdom grows, as the kingdom of God grows, it diminishes the other kingdom one believer, one person at a time, until the time when God determines the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and now is the time of your destruction. So I get asked a lot, well, do the powers of darkness think they can win? Well, it depends how you define win. I mean, they're not idiots. They know who God is. They're not going to beat God. But if win is defined as we're just going to distract the church adequately so that they don't do the Great Commission, we're going to kick that can down the road as long as we can,
yes,
and thus sustain our own existence. Okay, that is what it's about, because that is the trigger point. And so all of these ideas that we're familiar, we often don't connect them, even though the New Testament actually does connect them.
And one of the things, matter of fact, you gave the conclusion before we even finished here, because one of the things I enjoyed is the second to the last question. By the way, I might just say for our listeners, there are a number of sections, and section 4 is common questions and misconceptions. And the second to last one is that one. Why do Satan and the powers of darkness resist the kingdom of God? Are they are defeated? Do they think they can win? And the answer is no, they don't necessarily think they can win. As we always like to say, Dr. Heiser, we've all read the last chapter and we know who wins, and they probably know that as well, but they can distract. And I think that distraction is part of spiritual warfare, isn't it?
Yeah, they're prolonging the thing that they know that God wants. I mean, the epic narrative of Scripture is about God never giving up on the original plan, which was to have a human family created out of the gate to be fit for sacred space, his own presence, with the loyal members of the heavenly host, have these sort of families combined on earth, because humans cannot go to God, God comes to man. This is what God wants, and it gets ruined, but God never just sort of wipes his hands of it or says, well, let's do something different. He's always working the same plan again. And so when we get to the end, the final chapters, this is why everything looks like Eden. This is why there is no more sea, which is a very prevalent biblical metaphor for chaos and destruction and disorder, and the things that threaten human life. There's no more of this. So God is progressively moving toward that end. And again, the only strategy that darkness has is to, again, prevent the end from coming. They know it's going to come, but can we outlast it? Can we endure? Can we keep our little piece of turf here? Can we continue to harass and distract and not let God have what he wants? That's the only thing they can do. It, to be blunt about it, they don't do a bad job of it most of the time. The church is so frequently distracted from what it's supposed to be doing. We have all these little internal, parochial battles of this or that, theological point. And I'm a biblical scholar. Some of this stuff is really important. You have to have these discussions and these, sometimes even these conflicts. But the body of Christ, where we're at, especially in the West, we have the luxury of being free to disagree with each other over, really sort of arcane points of doctrine. And when we get absorbed with that, or some part of theology that isn't, sort of intrinsic to the mission, that is time spent in other places doing other things than the thing that when Jesus left, this is the task he gave to us. I mean, if Jesus could do the Great Commission all over again, he wouldn't come back and correct anything. it would still be the same. This is what you're supposed to do, because all authority is given unto me, not only in heaven but on earth as well. It's a signal to the principalities and powers. Those are spiritual rulers in a geographical sense. This is what it's supposed to be about. In the book, I articulate that the world is a mess because of 3 rebellions.
Let me come back to that because we're coming to a break, and I want to describe each one of those rebellions. The original rebel, the second divine rebellion, the third divine rebellion. And by the way, if you find yourself saying, I'd really like to get a copy of the book, it is now out, and we have information about it on the website, about 300 pages of great material about rebellions and demons, and we'll get into that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with Dr. Michael Heiser. The book is entitled Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness. And you talked about these 3 rebellions. Let's talk about that because it's kind of the middle part of the book, and it really is key to understanding what we're talking about.
Yeah, the way I put it in the book is if you ask the average Christian, why is the world the chaotic mess that it is? Why do we have evil, supernatural, and human? The answer you get is, well, it's Genesis 3, it's the fall. But if you ask the same question to a first century Jew or a literate Israelite, somebody who had a copy of the scriptures, that's not the answer you would get. The answer you would get is, well, there's actually 3 reasons for that. What happens in Genesis 3 in the garden certainly kicks it off, but we've got two others. We've got what happens in Genesis 6:1-5. We've got what happens at Babel, and they really sort of contribute badness. Each one of them, in their own way. The first one is sort of obvious, the one we know about. There's the problem that ensues from the fall is, of course, death. Everything dies now. Everything is anti-Eden. Everything is not the way it was supposed to be, and that's a terrible problem. We're not going to have eternal life, with God. This is what He wanted and what He intended. That's not going to happen unless we are brought back into relationship with Him. So we're also estranged from God. And then the second one, in Jewish tradition, it's universal here. I did an interview recently with Preston Sprinkle, and he called Genesis 6:1-5 the John 3:16 of Second Temple Judaism, because everybody agrees on this point. And that is what happened. I mean, there's the weird stuff with the sons of God and the Nephilim, but that really isn't the big deal. The big deal is this was viewed as the sons of God in Second Temple terms, the Watchers, not only come down and do what they do described in those first 4 verses, but they teach humans basically how to destroy themselves more efficiently. This is where we get the introduction of idolatry and astrology and, the arts of human seduction and warfare and bloodshed. I mean, all the traditions say that this sort of accelerated, the human condition that resulted from Genesis 3. And then that, rolls into what happens at Babel, when, according to Deuteronomy 32:8-9, if we read that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and a few English translations actually have it in there, like the ESV and the NRSV and NLT, and there's a few of them, that when God divided up the nations, when He fixed their borders, He divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. And this is a divorce. God has had enough with humanity. He divorces them, sets them, under the authority of lesser supernatural beings, that they themselves eventually rebel. And we find out from Psalm 82 that they're under judgment because they're corrupt and sow chaos among their nations instead of directing people back into relationship with the true God. And then God says, enough of you, and then He goes and calls Abraham. That's Deuteronomy 32:9. That's the flip side of the coin. And that sets the stage for the antipathy of the rest of the Bible. Israel against the nations, Yahweh against the gods, Yahweh incarnate Jesus against all the other, forces of darkness. So this gives you the landscape of what's going on. And if you believe this, if this is your worldview, you think the Messiah is supposed to address all 3 rebellions. And He does. I mean, this is why, we get the work of Jesus, not only the cross, but the resurrection and the ascension, which is the one that everybody sort of forgets about. All of this is set as a reversal theme or reversal themes to these 3 prior rebellions. And so we get a whole cast of characters. It's not just black hats, those are the demons, white hats, those are the angels. It's why we get certain vocabulary in Paul, because he's the apostle to the Gentiles, that we don't get with Jesus, confronting demons in the Gospels, and vice versa. It's why Jesus goes to certain places that are Gentile territory, and the demons address Him in different language than they do when He's, in Jewish turf. So you have a lot of these sort of subcurrents in the Gospels, in the epistles, whose contexts are dictated by this sort of 3 rebellion framework for the powers of darkness. And so one of the goals of the book is to try to alert people to sort of this structure. This is why the powers of darkness are talked about the way they are.
Right.
Who the groups are. What's the lay of the land here? The cast of characters.
And if nothing else, that's one of the reasons why I would think people would want to read the book, because we tend to look at demons from a 21st century view, and you take us back to the, if you will, the Jewish view. And the other part of this is that at a time when we have so many people that are unaware that there's even spiritual warfare, my argument is if you look at the Barna research, whether it's by Dave Kinnaman or now George Barna has his separate organization, you come to the very quick conclusion that a very significant number, even of born-again Christians, aren't really sure there's a true Satan. Well, how in the world could you actually be successful in spiritual warfare? How would you even begin to make sense of the armor that we would have to put on, or the way in which we would interact if you weren't even sure that you have an adversary? That makes sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it does in its own perverse way. The irony is that, this is a whole like subfield of philosophical theology. It's called, the academic term is the re-enchantment of the West. And the idea is that as the world becomes, on the surface more secular, in other words, a drift away from traditional Judeo-Christian thinking,
right,
it's actually becoming more spiritual in that void, you push away the Judeo-Christian worldview, that void is being filled by other things because a large portion of the population is very dissatisfied with a totally materialistic, atheistic worldview. And so
that's why they like superheroes and things like that, and magic and superheroes and all that. Yeah, that's right.
It preserves transcendence.
Yes.
It preserves wonder.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the ancient alien narrative, that's why that ridiculous show is in its 13th season. It provides this middle ground where there's something out there bigger than us, but it's not this God of the Bible, Jesus stuff. I don't want that, but I don't think science has all the answers either. They just don't even look at the anomalies that life, provides. It doesn't answer the questions that we all have.
Re-enchantment.
Thing.
That's right.
And a lot of Christians get sucked into that through media and entertainment, and they're so poorly taught in church that it still feels to them like they've got a quote-unquote spiritual worldview.
Yeah.
But it's not anything that's parsable by biblical standards.
Well, let me just real quickly, before we run out of time, and just about out of time, first of all, say that the book is out, and if you want to get a copy, we have information about that. Also have a link to your website. It is DR for doctor, and then MSH for Michael S. Heiser. And so, again, we have a link to the website. We have a link to the book, which is available in hardcover and Kindle. And if nothing else, I just thought it was just a way to remind ourselves that we're in the midst of a spiritual battle that lots of times we tend to ignore. And that's the kind of stuff we talk about here on Point of View. So, Dr. Michael Heiser, thank you again for what you do there at Logos and at the Faith Life Corporation.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we will get back into many of these other issues, and we may even get to a longer discussion about this. I just wanted to introduce you to the book because it just is coming out right now, and actually technically has an April 29th date, so even though I say it's out, you might be pre-ordering it, but you'll get it any day. And when we do have it out and available, I would encourage you to get a copy, and then we may do a follow-up interview on that as well. But if nothing else, did want you to know about that. And of course, his previous books, Angels, The Unseen Realm, and quite a bit of other topics that I think you'll benefit from. As you go to the website to find out about that or about some of the articles we've posted, don't forget we do have a button there that says Give Now, and we certainly would greatly appreciate your financial support before the end of our fiscal year on June 30th. I want to thank Alyssa, Ivy, and Andrew for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
If you thought the first half of 2020 was newsworthy, can you even imagine what's coming in the next 6 months? Coronavirus, the economy, social unrest, and an election. One thing I know, Point of View plans to be here for every important event, and as June comes to a close, so does our fiscal year. God has provided, but we're still a long way from where we need to be prepared for this important time. As Kerby says in his most recent letter, both Point of View and you have been brought together for such a time as this. God always knows what we need to be prepared, and this is the time to ask yourself, what is my role? Do your part to strengthen God's people for the days to come. Make Point of View your megaphone for the stretch run of 2020. Visit pointofview.net/team and do what you can. Or call 1-800-347-5151. This is not a time where we can afford to be silent. It is time for action. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.